It begins in a dimly lit interrogation room where the air feels heavy, stale with a lingering scent of coffee gone cold and cigarette smoke that seeped into the paint decades earlier. A single camera hums faintly from the corner, its red light blinking like an unblinking eye. Across the table sits a man whose life is about to change forever, not because of what he did, but because of what he will be convinced to say. This is where the story of Coerced Confessions begins. A hidden battlefield between psychology, fear, and desperation. In the late hours of the night, detectives often lean on exhaustion as their most potent weapon. A suspect, deprived of sleep and rest, stripped of hope, slowly began to crumble. "You don't remember everything clearly, do you?" a detective would whisper, his voice steady but laced with insinuation. The silence that followed carried more weight than the words themselves for the person in the chair. Every second stretched into an eternity of self-doubt. This case is not about one man alone, but about countless individuals who have faced similar crucibles across America's justice system. To understand the haunting reality of coerced confessions, we travel into the psychology of manipulation, the stories of the wrongfully accused, and the chilling truth of how science, once hailed as the savior of justice, was sometimes used as a weapon. It all started with a murder that rocked a small town, a case that demanded resolution. Police were under pressure, the community demanded answers, and political careers quietly hung in the balance. The detectives needed a suspect, and they thought they had found one. He was a young man, barely in his 20s, nervous, quiet, and not particularly articulate. He didn't have an alibi strong enough to convince anyone, and more importantly, he looked guilty to the eyes trained to see guilt everywhere. Hours turned into days, and the interrogation wore him down. He began to question his own memory. Did he really do it? Could he have blacked out? The words slipped from his mouth like poison. Maybe I was there. Maybe I did it. What followed was a confession that sounded like victory to the detectives, but was in truth a tragedy unfolding. The trial would hinge on those words, and soon, forensic science would be called upon to support them. But science, as we'll see, can be twisted, reinterpreted, or simply misapplied when it serves a narrative. As the gavel fell and the jury delivered their verdict, no one could imagine that beneath the surface of the confession lay a storm of deception, fear, and broken psychology, and the real story was only just beginning. The knock on the door came just before dawn, when the streets were still wet with last night's rain, and silence pressed against the walls of the small apartment. Inside, the suspect's mother opened the door to a group of officers who barged in with quiet authority. They weren't here to ask questions, they were here to end them. Her son was taken away, handcuffed, eyes wide with confusion and fear. Neighbors peeked through curtains, whispers spreading faster than the news could ever report. In the interrogation room, the tone was different. This wasn't about facts anymore, it was about control. The detectives leaned in close, their voices dropping low, a rhythm of accusation and suggestion. "We know you were there. We know what you did. You just need to say it." They slid photographs across the table, crime scene images drenched in blood and despair. "Look at her. Don't you want to do the right thing?" The young man's mind spiraled. The human brain under stress becomes malleable, memory itself reshaped by suggestion. Experts later explained that prolonged interrogations, lasting hours or even days, erode the ability to resist, pushing individuals toward false admissions. The suspect was trapped in a psychological cage, each bar forged from fatigue, fear, and the overwhelming desire for it all to end. At one point, he begged to go home. He asked for his mother. He asked for food. Each request was met with silence or another pointed question. And then came the fatal moment. A detective leaned in, voice soft, almost paternal. "If you just admit it, we can help you. Say you did it, and we'll let the court go easy on you. You'll be out before you know it." The words were bait, and exhaustion made him swallow. His voice cracked. Okay. I did it." The confession was recorded, typed into transcripts, and later played for the jury as undeniable truth. What no one in that courtroom knew or perhaps cared to know was how the confession had been pulled from the depths of manipulation. No forensic evidence tied him to the scene, no fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitnesses. But in the court of public opinion, the confession was everything. The case was practically sewn shut, but science was about to complicate the narrative. A single hair found at the crime scene was sent for analysis, a test that promised clarity. Instead, it opened a door to a controversy that would rattle the foundations of forensic credibility. In the hushed corridors of the forensic lab, the evidence lay under fluorescent light. A strand of hair, thin and fragile, became the centerpiece of the investigation. The examiner, dressed in a white coat, bent over the microscope with a sense of authority that seemed almost godlike. His testimony, later delivered in court, would carry the weight of scientific certainty. But here lies the tragedy. Science is only as trustworthy as the people who wield it. In those days, hair analysis was treated as near infallible. A match could tie someone irrevocably to a crime, swaying juries and sealing verdicts. And so it was with this case. The forensic examiner declared the hair consistent with the suspects, a phrase that sounded definitive, but in reality was vague, built more on interpretation than irrefutable fact. The jury didn't hear about the doubts. They didn't hear about the limitations of the method or the countless wrongful convictions later exposed by DNA testing. All they heard was the word match. Meanwhile, the suspect, sitting in his cold cell, began to believe his own confession. "What if I really did it?" he whispered to himself. His dreams were haunted by fragments of the crime scene he had been shown. The photographs burned into his mind until they felt like memories. Psychologists would later call this phenomenon memory internalization, a terrifying reality where false confessions begin to feel true even to those who give them. But outside the walls of the prison, cracks began to show. The victim's family remained unconvinced. They had doubts about the young man's guilt, and whispers in the community hinted at other possible suspects. An overlooked lead, a suspicious neighbor, a series of calls made on the night of the murder, details that didn't align with the neat story told in court. The truth was still out there, hidden beneath layers of fear and assumption, and it would take years and the courage of a few determined individuals to uncover it. Years passed, and the world moved on. But for the man behind bars, time stood still. The walls of the prison became both his punishment and his only reality. He counted days by the light that filtered through the barred window, by the echoes of footsteps in the hallway. But outside, a revolution in forensic science was underway, and DNA testing was becoming the gold standard of truth. The Innocence Project, a group of relentless lawyers and scientists, began combing through old cases, seeking out those where confessions seemed suspicious and evidence shaky. When they stumbled upon his file, they paused. The hair evidence, the confession, the lack of corroboration. It was a case that screamed for re-examination. A motion was filed, and years of appeals boiled down to one simple request: test the DNA. At first, prosecutors resisted. To reopen the case would mean questioning the very integrity of the justice system, exposing flaws that many preferred to keep buried. But eventually, under mounting pressure, the test was granted. The results were explosive. The DNA on the hair didn't match the convicted man. It matched someone else entirely, someone with a history of violence, someone who lived just blocks away from the crime scene. Suddenly, the carefully constructed story unraveled. The confession, once treated as the ultimate truth, was exposed as a lie born of coercion. But freedom did not come instantly. The legal system, slow and deliberate, dragged its feet. Prosecutors doubled down. Reluctant to admit error, years of appeals followed. Each one a battle fought in courtrooms where the weight of bureaucracy pressed down like an immovable force. Inside his cell, the man waited, his faith in justice long gone. But hope, though faint, flickered in the distance. When the courtroom doors opened again, the air was thick with anticipation. Reporters filled the benches. their pens scratching as they prepared to document a story of justice undone. The suspect, now older, weary, and marked by years of confinement, sat at the defense table. His lawyers laid out the evidence, the DNA results, the psychological reports on false confessions, the expert testimony dismantling hair analysis as outdated junk science. The prosecutors shifted uncomfortably. The jury leaned in. The judge listened with a furrowed brow. For the first time, the truth seemed within reach. Psychologists testified about the tactics used in the interrogation, the sleep deprivation, the false promises, the relentless pressure. They explained how the human brain, cornered and exhausted, can create confessions that sound convincing but hold no truth. One expert described it as a theater of guilt, where the suspect becomes both actor and audience in a performance directed by those in power. Then came the DNA evidence. The real perpetrator, identified at last, had already been incarcerated for another violent crime. The link was undeniable. The room fell silent as the weight of injustice became clear. But even in that moment, prosecutors hesitated. To admit wrongdoing meant to admit failure, and the system was built on the illusion of infallibility. Still, the tide could not be turned. The judge ordered the conviction vacated, and after more than a decade behind bars, the man walked free. The cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and the world watched as he took his first steps into freedom. But inside, he was hollow. "I don't know who I am anymore," he whispered to a reporter. The years have been stolen, his youth erased, his faith in justice shattered, and though he was free, the scars of coercion remained. The final chapter of this story doesn't end with a gavel or a press release. It ends with a haunting question that lingers in every courtroom across America. How many more innocent people sit in cells today, their lives defined by words they were pressured into saying? The man whose story we've followed lives quietly now, far from the noise of cameras and the shadow of prison walls. He attends therapy. He struggles with employment, and he tries to rebuild a life that was taken from him. But the memories never leave. The smell of that interrogation room, the faces of detectives leaning in closer, the sound of his own voice saying words that weren't true. The case sparked a national conversation about coerced confessions, pushing for reforms in how interrogations are conducted. Some states began requiring full video recordings. Others reevaluated the admissibility of certain forensic techniques. The Innocence Project continued its work, each exoneration a reminder of how fragile justice can be. But the larger truth remains chilling. Coerced confessions are not relics of the past. They happen still, in rooms with no windows, under fluorescent lights, where exhaustion and fear erode the human will. The justice system, for all its power, is built on the frailty of human psychology. And when that frailty is exploited, the consequences are devastating. As we close this chapter, imagine the sound of a prison door clanging shut. Somewhere, right now, someone innocent is whispering words they don't mean, believing it will set them free. And in that moment, justice dies a little more. Because in the end, the scariest truth of all is not that confessions can be coerced, it is that they can be believed.